Thank you so much, Max. And thank you for this wonderful platform to share our work. And thank you to all of you for being here today. It's wonderful to see new names and also names I know, especially folks from the Washington Family Engagement Association who have contributed so much to the research that's talked about here. And Ann Henderson, who is such a leader in the field and champion for parent leadership. So I hope in the discussion and question and answer part, all of you feel free to please speak up as well. You can advance the slide, Max. So Wendy and I will just start with some more introduction. I am the director of the Policy Research and Evaluation team at the NYU Metro Center, and we're a team of researchers based across the US who focus broadly on educational equity. And we do our work in close partnership with educators, families, students, and nonprofit staff. My area of focus is school-family partnerships and how to build conditions so that people who are most closely affected by decisions have voice and power in decision making. And my interest in this area really comes in large part to my experiences growing up. My parents and my grandmothers were definitely what I would say activists. They came of age during the civil rights movement in the US and the anti-war movement. And I learned from them that we all have a responsibility to speak up when something isn't right. But as a kid, I had very few opportunities to take meaningful action on the issues that I cared about. And so until college, there was always this disconnect between the values that I was taught and my opportunities to actually exercise those values. And so that's why I became really interested in this question of how do you make sure that people have every opportunity to use their voice and exert their power for social change. And I'll turn it to Wendy to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, everyone. So again, I'm Dr. Wendy Perez. I'm a senior research associate at NYU Metro Center. A lot of my studies focus on family engagement as well. I've been engaged with some of our youth studies, and I'm really interested in post-secondary outcomes. I've especially thought about outcomes for Latina students, and I'm also interested in connecting family engagement to post-secondary. How do we do that more? And what inspired me to do this work, I think first it's a personal experience. As the daughter of Ecuadorian immigrants who cared really deeply about education, I realized that that's not the messages I was getting at school. There was a lot of deficit notions and negative messages about how Latina parents engage with education. And so I really wanted to be a part of creating counter narratives to that and battling those myths. I call them myths. And I also professionally had a wonderful opportunity in my early career to be a part of a collaborative where we worked with many powerful parent leaders and youth leaders advocating for change in Los Angeles to district-wide policies to offer more post-secondary opportunities. And so these are some of the experiences that really inspired me to do this work. And now I'll hand it back to Joanna.
Thanks, Wendy. You can go to the next slide, Max. Thank you. So I'll start off by talking about the reasons we believe and we've seen that people in positions of power should work with parent leaders. So in our work, we've seen parents as powerful leaders across a range of settings and issue areas, anywhere from knocking on doors in their neighborhood to help families enroll their children in preschool, to fighting for and helping to implement culturally responsive curriculum in schools, to working with school districts to hire more teachers of color, to fighting for policies that protect immigrants and increase living wage and are generally good for children and families. And across all of these issues, we see that parents are usually activated because they care about their children with a sense of urgency. And because of this sense of urgency, they can really light the fire for policymakers to take on issues that otherwise might be sidelined or ignored altogether. They're also, and this is to quote a former advisory board member, Eileen Forlenza, the horizontal thread across vertical systems, meaning that while many decision makers are siloed into specific departments or agencies or issue areas, parents bring this understanding of how multiple systems converge to affect their families, and therefore they can be really effective bridges between policy actors. Because families understand the issues, they can also more clearly identify the actual problem and design more relevant solutions. So, for example, in one community in Mississippi in the southern US, there was low attendance at parent-teacher conferences, something that a lot of schools, I think, grapple with. And parents who are part of an organization called Parents for Public Schools recognized that it wasn't that parents didn't care about their children, but they weren't showing up because they couldn't leave their work. And so parent leaders worked with a local factory where many parents worked to hold parent-teacher conferences at the factory so that they could be more accessible to parents. And then because parent leaders communicate with other families, there's often more community buy-in and ownership when there's a change. And as a result, the new policies or practices are more likely to be sustainable. Next slide, please. So I've talked about how parents can be powerful as leaders, but we also know that it takes a lot to get many parents, especially parents who have never had an opportunity to be part of civic life, ready for roles where they're speaking up and out in the same room as elected officials and school leaders and people who are using all sorts of jargon and know all about the system already. So we work with parent leadership organizations throughout the US that really build this capacity in parent leaders to be leaders. And these are largely nonprofit organizations that are based in community settings, and they're typically funded by a mix of private foundations, government funding, and private donors. In 2022, our team really wanted to understand how many of these organizations were out there, where were they, what were they doing, what issues were they tackling. So we did a landscape analysis of parent leadership organizations throughout the US. We got a response from about 200 organizations, and we found that the organizations had several things in common. So first, they spent a lot of time very intentionally developing the leadership capacity of parents. Parents would have opportunities to practice public speaking. They would learn to facilitate meetings. These organizations oftentimes broker connections to elected officials. So a local school board member or city council member or mayor will come in and speak to the parents and kind of demystify the civic process. This also happens typically in a very family-friendly environment. So an environment where there is childcare, so parents don't have to choose between being home with their children and taking part in these initiatives, and an environment that supports parents and whole families. And so these initiatives really think about what does the parent and the whole family need to be successful, whether it's housing or childcare resources, or just having parents set goals for themselves and their families. Where do they want to be in 5 years? What kind of educational experiences or career experiences do they want to have? And then helping them work toward these goals. So it's really this holistic development of leadership, but also personal and family goals. The organizations that responded to the survey were primarily led by Black and Latino women. Most organizations were multilingual, so parents were speaking multiple languages and interpretation services were provided. And there were spaces that were friendly to immigrants. Many of the parent leaders were and are immigrants. And finally, they focus on a whole range of issues affecting children and families, education being the most common, but also issues related to racial justice and economic security, to mention a couple others. Next slide, please. So over a decade ago now, we started working with a large national team of parent leaders, staff from these organizations, funders, researchers to develop a theory of change for measuring the impact of parent leadership organizations. And this effort was spearheaded by Ann Henderson, who is here today, and Kate Gill Kresley. And in listening sessions all over the country, parents would sort of describe this life-changing process of joining one of these organizations and going from a sense of isolation and powerlessness, much like many of us, I think, are feeling now, to feeling a strong sense of self-worth and self-love, and this feeling that they had a second family among the other parent leaders and staff at the organization. As I mentioned, many parents would set personal goals and end up furthering their education or career. Some would leave an unhealthy relationship. Many reported much improved mental health. And then with this newfound sense of purpose and a much larger network, they would take collective action to address inequities. And in this process, public officials and other leaders like principals or superintendents of school districts would begin to take their ideas seriously and look to them for answers, support, and even in some cases, accountability. And then the final ripple, the fifth ripple, parent leaders invigorate democracy, is that parents across race, class, and language start to work together for the common good for their children. And at this level, we see more opportunities for parents to be decision makers and lend their voice, whether it's through new advisory councils or more forums or town halls where parents can participate. And even in many cases, we've seen parents becoming elected or appointed officials themselves. Um, so as I said, it's been a decade since the ripple effect was created, and we've done a lot of research and evaluation using and testing this framework. And in the process, I would say we got most of it right, but we've realized that a key ingredient of the original framework is missing, and that is the impact of parent leadership on the children of parent leaders. So over and over again, we've asked parents, what does it mean to you to build power? And what's the most meaningful part of this work? And surprisingly, it hasn't been the policy changes, although there have been many, but it's really been the lasting legacy that they're leaving on their children, and them showing their children and seeing their children following in their footsteps and knowing that they too can speak up and fight for justice. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into the research. So our research question that was underlying both of these studies is how does parent leadership help children learn and thrive? And we've done this since 2021 with two distinct studies, but with a lot of overlap. So the first study is a mixed methods participatory study on the Children's and Parent Leadership Training Institute. CLTI and PLTI is an initiative where parents receive intensive training over 20 weeks in civic leadership. So they learn things like how government systems work, how to fundraise, how to talk to the media. They do a community project to apply what they've learned. And in some locations, there's a parallel program for children ages 3 to 12. So when parents are in their leadership course, their children are in the same building, but a different space and learning the exact same concepts as their parents, only in a child-friendly way. I will mention that some sites do also do all of this virtually as well, but the concept is the same. So in this study, we hypothesized that if children and parents were learning the same civic concepts and skills at the same time, they would go home and talk about what they learned and then apply the lessons in the family. And therefore, their civic engagement would grow even stronger. So for this study, we did a survey of children and parents over 3 points in time. We also did many interviews with parents and their children, focus groups with CLTI and PLTI alumni, focus groups with CLTI teachers and junior teachers. photo voice, where parents and children took pictures of what civic engagement meant to them. And then we did a bunch of program observations. I also want to acknowledge that we had a participatory action research team of CLTI and PLTI alumni and staff who conducted the focus groups and advised on every part of the study and really were such an important part of this research. And then for study number two, we wanted to understand the impact of parent leadership on the children of parent leaders within parent leadership organizations that didn't have explicit programming for children like CLTI and PLTI do. So we selected 5 organizations across the US that primarily work with Black, Latina, and Indigenous families. And we did a case study of 5 of these organizations. And I just want to acknowledge the other members of our team who led the case studies of each organization, which are listed on this slide. Dr. Jennifer Casa-Leon, a co-PI of this study, Dr. Danielle Perry, Parker Foster, Sarah McAllister, and of course, Wendy. And so across these sites, researchers did in-depth interviews with parent leaders and their children, as well as other family members, such as spouses, older siblings, and grandparents. They also did parent focus groups, staff interviews, and program observations. And like study one, this study also had a strong participatory element where each site had a design council of parent leaders who advised on every step of the process. And in one site, the Kofi site in Illinois, the parent leaders even co-facilitated many of the interviews and helped analyze the data. And so with that, I will turn it over to Wendy to start sharing our findings.
Thanks, Joanna. So we'll just move to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about 6 key organizational practices that supported civic engagement and family well-being. And this resulted in changes in civic engagement and family civics, changes in family relationships, and also changes in school spaces. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And so yes, let's talk about these 6 practices. So the first one is building civic knowledge. So throughout both of our studies, parents and children learned about civic concepts. For some of them, this was done in a classroom where they learned about community, they learned about government, diversity. For others, it was done in watching their parents learn about campaign issues, about school issues, and then seeing them engage in those campaigns and advocacy. And these organizations provided opportunities for the families to practice civic skills. And one of the big skills that we saw was public speaking. And so in many of our stories, it starts with a parent or a child who was feeling a little bit shy. They, didn't know how to speak or didn't feel comfortable speaking out. They definitely had opinions and thoughts and ideas. And through these organizations, they were able then to advocate for themselves, for their children, and for their communities. Um, and and again, this was parents and their children. Another practice is the building of confidence gradually. And like I said, even parents and children who started off not being natural public speakers or not feeling comfortable speaking out on things, they started to speak out not only within their families and larger communities, but importantly at the school sites. And so we found for a lot of children, besides their local communities and their families, school was a really important community for them. So we saw students speak out for things there. And we also saw parents advocating for their children within their educational spaces and beyond as they built that confidence. And a fourth practice was that these organizations helped to develop social connections. So how did that happen? Well, because they were doing this work together. They were advocating for policies that they cared about collectively, parents and children alike. And they spent, for one of our organizations and studies, that these peers would be in the same classes, learning the same topics. And for a lot of these children and families, the connections went beyond their time in the organization. They had friendships that lasted beyond the activities related to the organization. And some even mentioned these social connections as family. They said, these are my family. And for my particular site, they called some of the organizational folks tios or uncles, and that's just a way of saying giving honor to that person, and that person is a meaningful adult in their life. Another practice was developing family cohesion. And so, as families connected socially with other parents, other peers, other community members, they also grew closer together because of these shared experiences, these shared times learning about issues, going to talk to electeds, or learning similar topics in their classes. And so, these families were close knit to begin with, many of them, but really got even deeper, got more close and learned a lot together as a family. And lastly, for the sixth practice, connecting learning to action. So as we looked at these families and organizations, what the process was is that these families and children identified issues that mattered to them. And that's a really important piece that we see throughout our work. It's not someone telling them what to care about, it's them identifying issues, whether it be IEPs that then grew into caring about that for their whole school, whether that be healthy school lunches. For kids, it was they really cared about the environment, they cared about bullying. And so these organizations really supported those issues that came up and took it from that to just learning these skills in advocacy, and then either leading campaigns, local school changes. And for one of our projects, they had, for PLTI and CLTI, they actually did community projects. So parents did a community project and children did a community project. So those are some of the ways that we saw these key practices play out. And now we can go to the next slide, and I'll hand it back to Joanna.
Okay, thanks. So the first big change that we saw as a result of these practices that Wendy described was changes in the civic engagement of parents and children and the ways that families engaged in civics together. So we identified 4 key ways that civic learning happened within families. And I'll say in many of our families, most of our families, these practices were already happening before they joined the initiatives. But the parent leadership organizations really help to enhance and deepen these practices. So related to modeling, children were very aware of the actions that their parents were taking in their communities. Even young children could speak about what their parents were doing, and watching their parents gave them this sense that it was important to speak up and advocate for themselves and others. Kids said over and over again, I was so proud of my mom or my dad or my grandma for speaking at this meeting or for making my lunches better. And so children really noticed what their parents were doing. We also heard about parents and children discussing all sorts of issues with one another. The issues range from local to national to global, depending on age, but always in a way that was very respectful of the children and their opinions and their right to disagree at times. A lot of the family civic discussion took the form of strategizing together to solve a problem. In study 1 in particular, we heard from children and parents that because they learned the same civic lessons at the same time, they could apply these lessons to issues that came up at school. For example, one child came home from school upset about a lunchroom policy where all kids were punished if one person at the table was misbehaving. And instead of just complaining about it and saying, well, that's that, he and his dad used their skills from CLTI and PLTI to sit down together and write a letter to the school principal. And then lastly, parents and children took action together, everywhere from cleaning up their neighborhoods to protesting to speaking at public meetings to collecting food and clothes for community members. And a lot of the civic actions of the youngest children actually took place within their family. So, as Carlos, age 8, said, my community that I'm in is family. I think it's important because you actually have people in your life to love and care for, and you should never be alone. And so, actions like watching a younger sibling or bringing a cane to a grandmother were ways that children began to form their civic identities within the home. Next slide, please. And so just a couple of quotes to illustrate these concepts related to modeling. One alum of Parent Ambassador said, my daughter grew up in non-welcoming spaces. That was like her playground, boardrooms, city council meetings, legislatures. She literally knows how to make herself a little home in every environment. When she can't go with me, she says, "I'm so sorry. Please apologize to them that I won't be there." She feels a part of the group. She feels comfortable being in conversation with the mayor, with legislators. She sees me speaking, so she has no fear speaking up. And then Alexi, age 12, said, "I loved going to the state capitol, a new place in Illinois, and spending quality time with my family and being together exploring. I like family time. I like it because you get to be with your family. It was fun being with them." And so, again, these parents aren't having to choose between being leaders in their community and being civic actors and spending time with their children. These organizations make it possible for children and parents to be together and for children to learn alongside their families through engaging the whole family in these civic actions. Next slide, please. Okay, so far we've presented a lot of qualitative data, and now I want to shift gears a little bit and share some quantitative data as well. And this data comes from study 1, the evaluation of CLTI and PLTI. So for this study, we surveyed parents and children at three time points: at the beginning, at the end of the program, and then 6 months later. So this graph shows those 3 time points along the x-axis. The black line is for the comparison group, and the blue line is for PLTI participants. And so you can see here that parent civic confidence with items such as "I am making a difference in the community" started out about the same for both groups. But by the end of PLTI, parents who participated were much higher. And that higher civic confidence was sustained even 6 months later. And so one PLTI alum said that she had always had the passion to help her community, but the missing piece was the knowledge of how everything works, which she learned which she learned in PLTI. Next slide. So this graph shows child perceptions of their own leadership. And this was measured by questions such as, "I am good at leading others to reach a goal." So we wanted to understand the unique effect of the intergenerational CLTI program over and above just the parent program. So we compared 3 groups in this graph. Group 1 was the comparison group, again represented by the dotted black line. Group 2 was represented by the purple line, and it includes parents and children in communities that only offered PLTI, but did not offer CLTI. And then group 3 was represented by the blue line and included parents and children who participated in both CLTI and PLTI. So this is where we expected to see the greatest impact, and we did. So you can see, again, the children who participated in CLTI started around the same level as the comparison group, but by the end of CLTI, they were higher, and their leadership grew even more at the 6-month follow-up. You can see on the purple line that among children whose parents participated in PLTI, but they themselves did not participate in CLTI, there's no leadership growth between time 1 and time 2. But there is actually some growth at the 6-month follow-up, showing that possibly kids grew their leadership skills just by being around their parents who had newfound leadership skills. Next slide, please. And then this final graph that we'll share today measured parents' reports of the frequency of civic discussion in their family. For example, "Our family talks about problems facing our community." And so you can see that for the comparison group on the black line, the line was flat, whereas parents who had children in CLTI reported more frequent civic discussions from time 1 to time 2, and this growth was sustained 6 months later. And then on the purple line for PLTI parents whose children didn't participate in CLTI, you can see growth from time 1 to time 2, but then a decrease 6 months later. So I think the takeaway here is that the intergenerational initiative really helped to increase and sustain the frequency of civic discussion within the family. And I'll turn it back to Wendy now for the next slide.
Thanks, Joanna. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the changes in family relationships. So what we found were that children and parents applied civic skills like patience, listening, and flexibility to their family relationships. So I'm going to read a few quotes and then we'll talk about them a bit more. So CLTI changed me as a person and as a sister too, as a daughter and as a friend. That was Sierra, age 12. Um, Another quote, Kofi has enabled me to be a better parent, a better man, and a better spouse. That's Isaiah with Kofi. Another quote, now I tend to listen more to my son. I learned to be patient and try to understand things from his own perspectives. That's Dominique with Parent Ambassadors. And lastly, mom has changed since becoming involved in organizing. She is more relaxed. It helped her self-esteem. She is more sure of herself and helped her develop her voice. Before she would hear me, now she is listening to me. So here we see how the changes in families are happening in different ways. It's happening in the way that parents believe in themselves and their confidence and their parenting, and so parents are experiencing that feeling, and also their children are noticing those changes. But we also see changes with siblings, and how siblings are noticing that they're for Sierra, she was the older sibling, and her younger brother was noticing she's changing as a sister, as a friend. They're getting along more because that's what they believe. That's part of their leadership growth. So we did see these really important changes in families. We can go to the next slide. We also saw changes in schooling spaces. And we'll talk about these in five big categories that we saw. So the first were parent leaders being advocates for their children. So they were speaking up for their children, for their own child and other children. We gave some examples of that. We also saw that parent leaders were advocates for policy. So they were helping to create policies about things that matter to them, right? To them and their families and their community that support learning and well-being. There were also decision makers, so they participated meaningfully in government and making decisions at their school sites. Um, and another way that parent leaders improved schools was that there were activators. They encouraged other families to get involved. So as they were engaging in these organizations, they talked about it to their friends and other family members because they wanted, to build more community. And lastly, they were role models. They showed children how to advocate for themselves and others. So now we'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Max. And so I wanted to share 3 quotes that show some examples of these practices. So for advocating for children, it overwhelmed me so with happiness to understand that we are making a change in our children's lives, especially in schools. This inspired me as a father, as a single father, to want to learn more, to be able to do more for my son, and not only for my son, for other children with IEPs or disabilities or mental illness. So we did see several examples of parents where they started with specifically IEPs, and it grew into thinking about special education and even bigger issues in schools. And a quote for role modeling. When my son goes to school, he tries to help more with his school teacher. He's trying to help more in class. He's trying to tell the students that they should help and different things like that. He's trying to encourage them. And this is Isaiah Kofi, parent leader. So Isaiah sees how his dad is a leader, how he's growing, how he's advocating, and then he's doing the same thing within his schools. And we've seen this with other children as well. Like this very much was a theme in our work. Um, and lastly, a quote for advocating for policy. It really does work. I've seen it work. I've seen school lunches get so much better because my mom was fighting for it. Those protests, those conversations with the principals, all that stuff that helps parents get involved with the school, it helps. It really does help. So just imagine being that young person and actually seeing that change in action, believing that what your parents do, that what you do makes a difference. And not only the children and young people, but those parents who are also engaged with those changes. It's a very powerful experience for both. And now, can we go to the next slide? And I'm going to hand it back to Joanna for recommendations.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. So just to share a few brief recommendations, and then I really look forward to opening up the floor. We have recommendations for 5 groups. For parents and caregivers, our recommendation is to meet your children where they are. The issue that they care about most likely won't be the issue that you care about most, but it's a great place to start. And the confidence that they develop from starting with the issues they care about will likely eventually carry into other issues. For school-based civic educators, we encourage you to consider how families can engage in the curriculum. Maybe it's providing discussion questions about the curriculum that come home. Maybe it's a workshop for the whole family to attend, or leading a family service learning project. I'm sure there's also been a lot of conversation in this webinar series about how family engagement should always be two-way. And so families also have a wealth of knowledge about their own civic experiences that they can share with students. For parent leadership and organizing groups, I think this research illustrates that having a curriculum for children is wonderful. Children gain so much. But we've also learned that children learn a lot about civics just by watching their parents. So even making meetings and events a welcoming space for the whole family can go a long way. For researchers, I think a finding for me that was really surprising was just how much participation in these leadership initiatives impacted the whole family, and impacted parenting, and patience and listening. And so I think an area for future research is really understanding the ripple effects into the thriving of the whole family, as well as really trying to measure tangibly whether a household income improved and families gained materially as a result of participating in these initiatives and then going on to further their education and their careers. And then lastly, for funders, we think investing in these types of initiatives just goes such a long way. The outcomes are so enormous on families, on civic life, on democracy, on individuals, and particularly to invest in intergenerational civic engagement, to ensure that organizations that currently just serve children or just serve families have the resources to make their work intergenerational. Next slide. And finally, just some acknowledgements. I could go on and on and on and on with acknowledgements, but I just wanted to put up on the slide the members of our research teams for each study. We certainly could not have done this work without our whole research teams. Our partners in this work, the National Parent Leadership Institute, CPLAN, Kofi, MyCop, Parent Ambassadors, and Ubuntu. And then our funders, the WT Grant Foundation, with additional support from the University of Michigan, and the Spencer Foundation. And that's all. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, one more slide. This slide just has the links to our reports, and I think we can drop them in the chat as well, so everybody can learn more about this research.